Hilchos Shegagos Perek Chamisha Asar. The laws of sacrifices for inadvertent transgressions, chapter 15. This is the last one. This chapter concludes the discussion of court's erroneous rulings, but it also brings in something that we learned way back in chapter 1. And that is that typically a regular Jew who does one of the sins, one of the 43 sins, for which you have to bring a karban chatas, would have to bring a female sheep or a female goat. That was the animal that a typical person had to bring. However, there were two exceptions to this. One is the king. The Torah is called the Yossi, but it's a reference to the Jewish king at the time. The king, when he does a sin, if he does one of those sins, instead of bringing a female goat, he actually needs to bring a male goat. That's clear in the Torah. And the Kohen Gadol, if the high priest commits one of these sins on his own, then he actually has to bring a bull. This picture is inaccurate. It has him with a goat. It should be a bull. Again, different to the regular person who brings a female sheep or female goat, he has to bring a bull. And again, these things are clear in the Torah. Here you have it, the passage about the king. It says, Asher nasi yecheta. If the king sins and he does one of the sins, then vehevias karbanei seir izim zachar tamim. He has to bring a male goat. And if it's the high priest, you have the passage here, im hakoyen hamashiach yecheta. If it's the anointed priest, he has to bring par ben bakar, a bull. So here's how the Rambam puts it out. Halacha aleph kvar bi'arnu, we already explained in chapter 1. Shekol shgaga, shehahediyet mevi aleh chatas hakvua, that any inadvertent sin, for which a regular person would bring the standard sin offering, kisba oy seira, female sheep or a female goat. Im shagag bo hanasi, if it was the king who made the mistake and did the act inadvertently, maybe Sawyer, the king would have to bring a goat, a male goat. V'im shagag bo kayin mashiach, and if it was the high priest who made the mistake, maybe Pari has to bring a bull. Says the Rambam, let's qualify that for a moment, let's give a little caveat. When do we say that a high priest brings a bull for his inadvertent act? When he made a mistake in ruling for himself. That means that he had to mindfully think about this particular sin, tell himself that it's permitted, as though he were a court issuing a ruling to himself. He needs to tell himself that it's permitted. And he does the act on the basis of his mistaken ruling. In other words, for a high priest to be eligible to bring the bull, he had to have taught himself a halacha and acted based on his own personal teaching. And he also has to be a very great sage. Because it says in the verse that describes the high priest's obligation, it says, Im hakoyen hamashiach yecheta le'ashma sa'am. If the high priest sins for the guilt of the people. Why does it say for the guilt of the people? Hare Mashiach katzibur. That means that the Torah wants to compare the high priest to the rest of the community. Ma hatzibur shehein bezdin. The same way the community, which in this case is a reference to the high court, einan chayavin bekarban, are only liable to their sacrifice. Ad sheyu chachamim re'uyin lohira, until they meet all those conditions. Remember these 9 conditions here. They have to be sages, they have to be eligible for ruling on the court. V'yitu b'hira, they have to make a mistake in their ruling. V'yasu ha'osim al pm, and those that are acting have to do it based on their word, not based on their own understanding. V'yodu levatel miktzas or lekayim, miktzas, as we saw yesterday at length, they have to cancel part of a mitzvah but also preserve part of it. Kach hamashiach b'chol hadrachim ha'elu, so too the high priest is in all of these matters. He has to also meet all of these conditions. Halacha beis, let's give some examples of this. Ketzat, what does this look like? Kohen Mashiach sheta b'hira le'atzmai. A high priest made a mistake in ruling for himself. V'dima, and he imagined, for whatever reason, shehazerek min shus l'rishus b'shabbos muter, that while carrying from one domain to another is forbidden, throwing is permitted. That's what he thought. There's a difference between going out of your place or just throwing an object, as we learned yesterday a little bit. And then he is going ahead and actually doing the act. He throws the object from domain to domain, hanging his hat on his own ruling. When he finds out his sin, he'll actually bring the bull that we mentioned before as a sin offering. But if he didn't, in the moment, remember his ruling, and that wasn't what he was hanging his hat on, he simply forgot and threw something inadvertently, or he was hanging his hat on his ruling, but he wasn't an expert sage, so his ruling didn't mean that much, or he uprooted an entire entity, an entire mitzvah, in ruling to himself, or he made a mistake and he did rule to cancel only part of it, but he didn't act relying on his ruling. He acted in a different lapse of awareness. Or he was purposefully ruling. It wasn't an erroneous ruling, it was a purposeful ruling that he made to himself to allow himself to compromise the Torah. But then when he actually came to doing it, it was in a moment of inadvertency. In all these cases, he's exempt from a sacrifice at all. Because the law of a high priest with regards to himself carries the same exact laws as the court with regard to the people in every matter. Let's say the high priest issued a ruling to himself, but then later on he forgot the basis for his ruling. It's like, I knew I had a logic to it, but I forget what it is. And when he acted and did the sin, he said to himself, I'm performing this sin on the basis of the logic that I had when I made the ruling. When he discovers his problem, his mistake, he has to bring a bull, because he was relying, again, on his original ruling. Let's say the issue was idol worship. Like we saw yesterday, the Torah only says you cannot bow in prostration to idol worship. It doesn't say clearly that you cannot kneel. Now, kneeling is learned from tradition that it's also forbidden, but what's in the Torah is only prostration. So let's say the high priest made a mistake. He canceled part of the mitzvah and he preserved part of it. He said, you know what, prostration is prohibited, kneeling is permitted. And then he acted in accordance with his ruling. Interesting here, the high priest will bring a female goat like a regular person. Why is this case different? Why do we have the high priest not bringing the bull in the case of Avodah Zarah? Because the Torah, when it describes the sin of Avodah Zarah, it says v'im nefesh achas. If any soul does a sin, which means anybody is the same. As the Rambam tells in chapter 1, society doesn't make a difference. In the other 42 sins, yes, but in the sin of idol worship, everybody's equal. V'hu sheyishgag b'hoira, so long as he issued the ruling in a state of inadvertency. As we explained. She'ein hakohen HaMashiach chayav karban, because the Rambam again reiterates that the high priest is only liable to a sacrifice ela behelim davar b'hoira im shigigas hamaisa. If he has a lapse of awareness when it comes to the ruling, and he also acts and does the sin inadvertently, kitzibur, just like the community, the Beis Din. Avalim shagag b'maisa bilvad b'lo. But if he only made a mistake with action, without the ruling, bein ba'avodah zarah, bein b'shar mitzvahs, ein mevi karban klal. Whether it's idol worship or other mitzvahs, he doesn't bring a sacrifice at all. Very interesting concept. The high priest will not be held accountable in terms of his sacrifice if he only acted and didn't rule to himself. Halacha dalid hoiraha kayin mashiach im Beis Din. What if the high priest gave a ruling together with the court? Because the high priest could be on the court, and he was part of the court when they issued this ruling. So the court is giving out an erroneous ruling, and there he is on the board as well. The shagag hu v'heim v'hoira, both he and them made a mistake in their ruling. Even though they may act later. And they means everybody, the community and the high priest himself, acted based on the mistaken ruling which they gave out. Since the high priest didn't rely exclusively on his ruling, only on his ruling, together with the ruling of the court, he's exempt and doesn't require an atonement for himself. Rather, if it was one of those cases where all 9 boxes were checked and the court is bringing their own sacrifice, the high priest achieves atonement together with the community. But if it was transferred to the doers, these conditions were not met, and so all the individual Jews were bringing the sacrifice. The high priest doesn't have to bring a sacrifice, because in this scenario, the high priest doesn't require forgiveness for himself, because he only requires atonement if he does the act based on his own ruling personally. Similar case. The court is ruling together with the high priest in a mistaken situation. But it was different mistakes. They made a mistake when it came to forbidden bloods, and he made a mistake when it comes to forbidden fats. So here, even if the community is bringing a sacrifice, he cannot achieve atonement with them. Is to bring a bull for himself. A high priest who is in doubt. Im shagag shegagazu, shehi shigagas hayra im hamaisa. Whether he made this mistake, the full mistake, meaning the mistaken ruling with the mistaken act, or not, he doesn't bring a doubtful guilt offering, as usually you do when you're in doubt whether you did a sin. Because again, the high priest's sins are treated like the communal sins, where the court doesn't bring a doubtful guilt offering if they're in doubt whether they made a mistaken ruling. Therefore, neither does the high priest. But the king, if he is in doubt whether he sinned or not, maybe he has to bring a doubtful sin guilt offering like any other person, because his inadvertency does not depend on a mistaken ruling like the court or like the high priest. He's like a regular person. If he acted inadvertently and made a mistake, he has to bring atonement. Therefore, if he's in doubt, he has to also bring atonement. Now, even though I've been telling you this whole time that a nasi is a king, the Rambam never said it clearly, so he says it now. When Torah says Asher Nasi Yechata, when the Nasi sins, who's the Nasi? Zeh Melech. It's a reference to the king. She'ein alav Rashus or Rishus me'adam Yisrael. Nobody from Israel has authority over the monarch. Ve'ein lamayla mimenu b'malchusay ala Hashem alekav. The only person above him in sovereignty is God Himself. The monarch is the highest position in terms of rulership and authority in the Jewish nation. Even though for certain laws we do care about which dynasty he's from, David's dynasty or other dynasty, here it doesn't make a difference. To be a Nasi, you could be any type of king, from the house of David or other tribes. If there's a time in history where there was multiple kings, and no king was serving the other, they were all leading their own little reign, their own little kingship, as happened a few times when the kingdom split and there was different kings. So then, every individual king is treated as the Nasi in this scenario, and if he sins, he has to bring a goat for his inadvertency. What is called the anointed priest? So here, actually, we're a little bit more particular. It's specifically a reference to the high priest in the early days, when they still used to be anointed with the anointing oil. Not a high priest who was simply installed by wearing the priestly garments. Because as we saw in the Rambam's last book, once the Shemen HaMishcha disappeared after the first temple, how did they install a new Kohen Gadol? Simply by dressing him up in the clothes. But this law wouldn't apply there, because Torah doesn't call him the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, it calls him the Kohen HaMashiach, the anointed priest. So he has to be the type of high priest who is actually anointed. Halacha Zayin, Kohen Gadol shenimshach, b'Shemen HaMishcha, ve'avar me'avedase. What if a high priest was anointed with the anointing oil, but then he left his post? Maybe he got a blemish that he couldn't serve, or he got old, and it was just time to retire and bring the next one in. But he sins in this inadvertent way, meeting all the classifications. He gave the ruling, he acted on his ruling. Maybe paral shegagos. Fascinatingly, even if you're not currently working as a high priest, for this law, you're still under this law. He has to bring a bull for his inadvertent act. Because there's no difference between a high priest who is in service or a high priest who used to be in service, only the bull of Yom Kippur, which only the current serving high priest brings, and the daily sacrifice of the high priest, the pancakes, which those are only brought by the high priest who is currently in service. But this bull, which is brought for inadvertencies of all mitzvahs, shavim him by. Both the current and the prior high priest, as long as they were both anointed with the anointing oil, are subject to this bull in the case where they make a mistake and act on the mistake. Let's say the king acted as part of the people following the court. So the last 3 days, right, what are we talking about? Court issues a mistaken ruling and everybody follows them. What if the king is one of the people who follows them? He doesn't require his own sin offering. he can be atoned for together with the people. She'ima yu bezdin, heim she'ikrivu al Shegagosan. If it was a case where the court had to bring the sacrifice for their offering, all the 9 conditions were met. Everybody and the king are exempt from the sacrifice, as we explained. And if it was a case where the people had to carry their own liability because the 9 conditions were not met, and the king was one of the doers, he just acts like a king would in a regular case and brings the male goat. Because the male goat of a king is exactly equivalent to the female sheep or female goat of a regular person. So in any scenario where a regular person would have to bring their sin offering, the king has to bring his type of sin offering. If a king gets tsaras, the lesions on the skin, until it heals. So he has to go away from his kingship. He has to resign his post. And once the king resigns his post, he becomes like a regular person. And therefore his sacrifice will now change. Now if he sins, he has to bring the regular female sheep or female goat, not the male goat. So what happens? Let's say he did the sin while he was still king. Then he left his greatness. Now he still has to bring the male goat like a king. Shenamar, because it says, where is it? Al chatasoi asher chata. For the sin which he sinned. Interestingly, this is a word that's said by the high priest, not by the king. Al chatasoi asher chata, for the sin which he sinned. But nevertheless, the Talmud learns that this also applies to a king. Kishas chatasoi humevi. He has to bring it according to the status that he was carrying while he was doing the sin. He did the sin while he was a king, even though now he's no longer a king, he brings the sacrifice like a king. What if it was the opposite? What if the high priest or the king did a sin before they were appointed, while they were still regular people? Even though they only found out about their sin. After they were appointed, they are like a regular person, because that's when they sinned. Because it says, Asher nasi yechata, if the king sins, here it says, if the high priest sins. That means they have to sin while already in the state of being the king or the high priest. Therefore, let's say you ate doubtful forbidden fats while you were regular person. You found out about the doubt after you were appointed to the high priest position. You have to bring a doubtful guilt offering, even though a high priest doesn't usually do so. But he's found out about a doubt from earlier. Very interesting case. Person eats half an olive-sized portion of fat while he's still a regular guy. Then he gets appointed to being a king, still in the same lapse of awareness, eats another half of an olive-sized portion now as a king. Or he ate the first half of an olive-sized portion while he was still a king, and then the other half after he resigns his post. These two halves don't combine. He's exempt. If he ate half an olive-sized portion while still a regular guy, then he was appointed to the presidency, to the kingship, then he resigned his post, and then ate the other half. So he ate both halves in a state of being a regular guy. It's a doubt whether it combines, or does the momentary kingship that he was in, does that stop the process and divide the two halves? And blessed is Hashem who grants us assistance. Mazel tov for concluding the laws of Shegagos and inadvertent transgressions.